Number 1.
Kaycee Lemire, age 22 to 23, went missing from Tampa, Florida on September 5, 1983, or 1984. She was last seen leaving her home to go to a bar, according to NamUs. Her residence, based on this ad run by her family in 1985, was likely near the intersection of Bush and Nebraska. I know next to nothing about Tampa. I've never been there. Oddly, about the only thing I'm slightly familiar with in Tampa is a bar. At the intersection of Bush Boulevard and 40th, not very far from Bush and Nebraska, is a bar called Char Pal Lounge. It is familiar to me, not because it had an appearance in the movie Goodfellas, but because 17-year-old Tins Lucinda Hewells vanished from there in October 1984. I can't help but wonder if that was the bar Kaycee was headed to. Kaycee, sometimes referred to as Kaycee, was 5'3", according to the state of Florida site. Her weight is listed as 105 pounds, with strawberry blonde hair and brown eyes. Anglin was her maiden name. She married on 4/23/1983. The state of Florida site gives her missing date as 9/5/1983, however her sister's social networking site says she disappeared in September 1984. I believe it was 1983. I found this UID that I thought could be a match, and have submitted it to the medical examiner associated with the UID. The hide is off from the NamUs profile, but the FBI version lists 503. The hair color also looks off in the photos, as the UID recon looks to have dark brown hair, but the hair color for the UID is listed as strawberry blonde. Whether she went missing in 1983 or 1984, it could still work. The medical examiner responded, saying he'll look into it. It's hard sometimes to comb through UIDs with no information at all about the circumstances of one's disappearance. There's always the possibility that she left of her own accord and that her family knows this, but just doesn't know where she is. I hope that is the case, and that she is alive and well somewhere. From her sister's social networking page, it looks as though she is truly missed.
Number 2.
Rosemary E. Hamilton Buck, age 20, went missing from Syracuse, New York on August 11, 1973. Rosemary was last seen by her mother at Rosemary's apartment at 1102 Wolf Street in Syracuse. According to her mother, Rosemary had been up most of the previous night crying. She was struggling with alcohol and a bad marriage. She was concerned about the danger of her young son being taken away by Child Protective Services, since her husband was incarcerated for breaking and entering at the time. She had been in a mental hospital at some point and had been trying to get her life together at the time of her disappearance. On the morning of August 11, she told her mother that she was exhausted and would run away if Child Protective Services continued to harass her. She'd asked her mother to please fight for Ronnie, her son, if this happened. Later that day, her mother left, taking Rosemary's young son with her. When they returned that evening, Rosemary was not there. Her family never saw or heard from her again. A downstairs neighbor came forward and said that they had seen Rosemary hitchhiking on the corner of Wolf and 6th. The witness said that Rosemary got onto the back of a motorcycle. A couple years after Rosemary's disappearance, the wife of her brother, who lived in Texas, received a bizarre phone call. There were two females on the line, and they claimed to be calling from Cleveland. One of the women was heard telling the other, "Be careful what you say, don't give your name." Rosemary's sister-in-law told authorities that the caller appeared to know things about the family that only Rosemary would know. Strangely, there is no indication of what the caller wanted. I think that could be a huge clue. I'm also curious to know, since it wasn't specified, if the one of the women on the phone seemed to be commanding the other, or if they seemed to be friendly with each other. Did Rosemary know anyone in Cleveland? It's been reported that Rosemary had told friends that she eventually intended to go to Boston to meet a male friend. I'm not sure if eventually would refer to at some point in her life, or if it meant that would be where she was trying to hitchhike to. There is also no mention of whether she took any belongings with her, which makes it difficult to conclude whether she likely did run away. Rosemary is reported to have frequented the Yellow Balloon at the time of her disappearance. The Yellow Balloon was a music venue in Syracuse, but its name was changed to the Lost Horizon in 1971, 2 years before Rosemary's disappearance. She also liked to travel to attend rock concerts. Rosemary's son is in his 40s now and has only vague memories of his mother. He is eager to find out what happened to her, as are other family members. I don't see any UIDs that seem to match in New York, unless by chance she'd gone down toward New York City, but there's no real reason to think she would have.
Number 3.
The mystery of Rose Lee Nicole is one that stays on my mind constantly. I've been putting off featuring her here for a couple reasons. The first and most significant reason is that, although she has received no press coverage in the media, she is high profile in the MP community, so I have figured that most of my readers are already familiar with this story. It's also a complicated one that is difficult to dissect and still have it make sense. Rose Cole was born on December 23, 1956 and lived with her father and siblings in Flint, Michigan. In September 1972, at the age of 15, she ran away from home and somehow found herself at the mercy of the courts. After a comment Rose reportedly made about selling drugs, she was sentenced to a treatment program called Synanon in Oakland, California. Synanon was later found to be a cult, with its leaders having violent tendencies against anyone who attempted to leave or help its residents leave. It was eventually shut down by the government. We do have some record of her time at Synanon, thanks to some letters she sent home, which were saved by her family. Much of the writing from while she was in Synanon was poetry, desperate pleas to come home, and feeling that her family no longer wanted her. She mentioned a girl named Ruth who she had become friends with, and a man named Rick, who she disliked. Neither Rick or Ruth have ever been identified or located. Rose eventually ran away from Synanon and sent a couple more letters home from Chinatown in San Francisco. These letters expressed some fear of being found by Synanon and brought back. She no longer signed her full name, but only her initials. In her last letter, she said she would not be contacting her family again until she turned 18 and could not be ordered back to Synanon. She additionally stated that she was staying in a big house with an older couple and that she'd contracted a kidney infection. The last letter was written on her 16th birthday, December 23, 1972. It was not mailed until February 3, 1973. She'd added a note saying she'd just gotten a stamp. This is the last positive contact we have from her. Interestingly, a court document dated January 1974 was located, which was a dismissal of all charges against Rose. The document strongly implies that Rose was present at this court date, but her family members all denied that she was in fact present. During the time that Rose has been missing, her father and stepmother split up and her father remarried again. A child of this later wife has recently come forward to say that Rose called sometime between 1979 to 1982, the period that Rose's father was married to this wife, and stated she'd been living on the street for a year. It is unknown whether she was referring to the streets of San Francisco or elsewhere. This is one of several cases, Melinda Creech and Ida Dean Richardson Anderson come to mind, where the missing person was in the custody of the government at the time they went missing. In each of these cases, including this one, the government has been uncooperative in trying to help the families locate the person the government was responsible for. I just don't get it. I do get that people run away and that the government can't watch every single person 24 hours a day, but can you imagine if you lost someone else's child and wouldn't cooperate with the child's family? You'd be locked up in a minute, so why does the government get away with it so easily? I hope Rose just got on with her life under a new identity somewhere. I think it's just as likely as any other scenario. It's also possible that she ended up back at Synanon, or that something happened to her on the streets of San Francisco, or that she could still be a part of San Francisco's massive homeless population. Many wonderful people have worked very hard to figure out what might have happened to Rose, to no avail. A few former Synanon residents have been contacted, but none could be sure if they'd ever seen her. A multitude of UIDs have been compared, but all have been ruled out. I am trying to find someone who may have been familiar with Chinatown in the early to mid-1970s. We've thought of trying to locate free clinics, since she said she had a kidney infection. It insinuates that she saw a doctor, but the odds of anyone remembering her are so slim, unless Chinatown was less touristy then, where a girl like Rose would have stood out among the Chinese population. There is also the idea of finding an old San Francisco city directory and try to contact older Chinatown couples who lived in a house, but, of course, we don't know how much older. She was 15 to 16, so 30 would be older. And we don't know nationality or anything else. We would also like to locate Ruth, the friend of hers from Synanon, but we don't know her last name. Rose's parents are deceased, but her siblings are still searching for her.
Number 4.
Mary Catherine Greene, age 34, vanished from Dundalk, Maryland on December 10, 1966. Mary and her 4 children were living with Mary's father in a trailer at 3701 Old North Point in Dundalk, Maryland at the time, as she was in the process of finalizing her divorce. She was last seen at 6:30 p.m. when she left her children in her father's care, stating she was going to the store. She never returned. Her blue and white Ford station wagon is also missing. I believe Mary and her husband had lived on J.D. Avenue in Baltimore in 1959, the nearest city directory I could find to 1966. Her husband, Howard Greene, later moved to Arizona and is now deceased. Today, I was fiddling around in NamUs checking for updates on some of the cases I'd already profiled, and I came across this Jane Doe. I knew I'd recently seen a missing person case that involved the city of Dundalk, and I kept trying to figure out which case it was, but couldn't find it. It turned out to be the case of Mary Catherine Greene, who, for some reason, is listed as being missing from Edgemere in NamUs. No wonder I couldn't find it. I'm confident that she went missing from Dundalk, however, since we have an exact address, and it's definitely in Dundalk. Unless they've confirmed that she made it to the store and that the store was in Edgemere. Jane Doe only has dentals available, and Mary only has DNA available, so it does not appear that she has been ruled out. There is really no identifying information on Jane Doe, so I'm really only looking at the proximity to where she went missing and where she may have been headed. Jane Doe was located on the 3100 block of Dundalk St. The location where Jane Doe was found is about a 10-minute drive from the trailer where Mary and her children were staying. Jane Doe's resting spot is about 8 minutes from where I believe Mary and her husband had lived together previously, which could well have been where her husband still lived in 1966. It was also very close to where several commercial businesses were in 1959, which is the latest city directory I could find, including a department store, a grocery store, a shoe store, and a sandwich shop. It's possible that this area was her destination, although there are no details on what store she was headed to. Whenever it's mentioned that the missing person was in the process of a divorce, one can't help but think that the husband may have been involved in her disappearance. In this case, there's no indication that he was abusive or violent, or that he was ever suspected by law enforcement. It also occurred to me that she could have come into contact with Marvin C. Lemons, a schizophrenic who confessed to the murder of Debbie Kelly in Baltimore around 1969. Marvin's residence in 1969 was about 20 minutes from where these remains were found. Marvin, according to newspaper articles, worked as a relief man in various white coffee pot restaurants in the Baltimore area. He was suspected in at least 3 other murders of women whose bodies had never been found. I wonder if Mary was one of them. It was mentioned in an article pertaining to Marvin Lemon's trial that he had kept a sketchbook that police felt represented his victims, as well as a list of names and dates. Only the sketch and list entry relating to Debbie was mentioned in the article. I'm curious if there was anything that might relate to Mary. Although Marvin Lemons, in his confession, stated that he'd placed Debbie Kelly's remains in a trash bag and handed them to the garbage collector, I don't think it's impossible that these remains could belong to Debbie if they don't belong to Mary. Debbie had told her boss at some point that she lived on Dundalk and Broadway. I hope they can get a DNA sample from the remains, since it's unlikely that dental records from 1966 can be found.
Number 5.
Janice Baze, age 36, was last seen in El Paso, Texas in July 1974. Following a heated argument, Janice left home with her husband of 19 years in the family car. He returned without her. Mr. Everett Baze told the children that she'd gotten on a bus to visit family in another state, but never arrived. Janice's children do not believe she would have left them behind, or that she wouldn't have contacted them in all these years. Janice was not reported missing until November 1974, and Mr. Baze was considered a person of interest in her disappearance at that time. According to one of Janice's sons, their father was a heavy drinker and was abusive to Janice and the children. Janice and her husband were officially divorced in 1977, 3 years after her disappearance. Following the divorce, Mr. Baze had a string of short-lived marriages before moving to Washington, where he eventually passed away in 2010. In looking through unidentified remains, I saw nothing in the immediate vicinity. I do not know how long Mr. Baze was gone when he left with Janice, or if it was during the day or night, but Texas is a huge state to get to Houston, and back, for example, would take over 20 hours at today's speed limits. To Dallas and back would be over 16. There is the possibility that they crossed the border into Mexico, so I looked to see if Ciudad Juarez, which borders El Paso, had any UIDs online. I did not find any, but I did find an interesting article about their intent to exhume and try to identify their John and Jane Does. They have thousands, according to the article. El Paso, Texas is also very close to the Las Cruces area of New Mexico, but I didn't find anything there either. I saw a possibility in Albuquerque, but that would be a nearly 8-hour trip by today's standards. Of course, the Rio Grande runs through El Paso, and if she'd ended up in the river, she could be found in any number of border towns in Texas or Mexico, but I think that's unlikely. The Rio Grande can be dangerous, and there have been plenty of accidental drownings there, but it is a swimming attraction and not a raging river, so anybody placed there would be likely to surface quickly. Janice Baze was not a petite woman, she was between 5'9", 5'11" and 280 to 320 pounds, according to her NamUs profile. This makes it unlikely that her husband would have killed her and later returned to relocate her. Without assistance, he would have a very difficult time trying to lift her, and it's unlikely that he had any help since his family, other than Janice and their children, lived in another state. Mr. Baze had come to El Paso for a military assignment. Sometimes I use Google Earth to scan open space near the location of a person's disappearance. It's common for age-old remains to be stumbled onto by hikers, hunters, and dog walkers, so I don't think it's too far-fetched that a skull or large bone could be visible in the bird's eye view. There's lots of open desert space in and around El Paso. In one area I could see what appeared to be the remnants of a fire in the middle of nowhere, and another remote spot with a large amount of debris, including several tires. I saw a few small white objects, but zooming in causes blurriness, so it wasn't possible to tell what they were. Janice's 5 children are still seeking answers, and I am truly hopeful that 40 years later, 2014 will bring those answers.